What if the Allies didn't just fight the Nazis? They hired them. While the world cheered for victory in 1945 in the shadows, deals were struck. Quiet handshakes, secret flights, files rewritten. Some of Hitler's men didn't die or disappear. They defected. They collaborated. They became assets. These are not redemption stories. These are escape stories of generals, spies, and ideologues who changed flags without changing beliefs. 25 men who served the Reich and then served its enemies. You were never supposed to know their names, but now you will. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the stories history tried to bury. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Middle of the workday? We won't judge. These are the kinds of stories that don't let you sleep anyway. 1. Fritz Kolbe. The perfect traitor doesn't look like one. He doesn't wear a trench coat or speak in code or carry a cyanide capsule in his cheek. He wears wire-rimmed glasses, sighs too much at staff meetings, and gets treated like wallpaper by the men who assume he's loyal because he's boring. That was Fritz Kolbe. In 1943, Kolbe was a mid-level courier in the German Foreign Office. Nothing flashy, no swastika armband, no SS insignia, just a man with a satchel, walking through corridors of policy with eyes that didn't blink as much as they burned. What made Kolbe dangerous wasn't what he believed, it was what he no longer believed in. The Reich disgusted him. So he carried their secrets in his briefcase straight to the Americans in Switzerland. He used the code name George Wood. Under it, he gave the OSS a flood of classified material. German troop movements, sabotage plans, even internal memos between Nazi ministries. Allen Dulles, future CIA director, called Kolbe the most valuable spy of the war. The Nazis called him nothing. They never even knew. Kolbe was never caught. After the war, he was rejected by West Germany as a traitor, which tells you exactly what post-war forgiveness actually meant. But Kolbe was not alone in his quiet rebellion. Another man, far higher up, far better dressed and even more disillusioned, was already playing both sides while stationed in Switzerland, just a train stop away. 2. Hans Bernd-Gisevius. Hans Bernd-Gisevius had the kind of resume that would normally guarantee post-war execution. Gestapo founding member, Abwehr agent, Nazi diplomat. But like a good paradox, the more terrifying his title sounded, the less loyal he actually was. Gisevius wore the uniform but spat in the boots. While officially working under diplomatic cover in Switzerland, he made himself indispensable to the OSS. Allen Dulles again, his inbox was practically a Nazi Rolodex, relied on Gisevius for insider intelligence on Hitler's internal chaos. Gisevius fed them not just names and dates, but motives, betrayals, and the hollow sound inside Hitler's cabinet. And yet, Gisevius didn't switch sides out of love for democracy. He hated Hitler, sure, but mostly for turning Germany into what he saw as a clownish death cult. Gisevius believed in his version of Germany, noble, efficient, powerful, but not insane. So he played a long game, help bring down the Reich, survive the collapse, then step into the power vacuum with clean hands and a cleaned-up resume. He testified at Nuremberg, wrote books, lived comfortably. Was he a hero? Depends who's writing the story. But one thing is clear. If Gisevius was the insider cynic, the next man was the true escape artist, a defector with a suitcase, a wife, and a ticket out before the Gestapo could blink. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not here for the surface-level version of history. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Are you watching this in the middle of the night or pretending to work? Either way, you're in the right place. 3. Erich Vermeeren. Erich Vermeeren wasn't supposed to be in the Abwehr. He was a lawyer, a Catholic, a monarchist, and married to a baroness. Not exactly Nazi poster material. But the Abwehr, ever full of aristocratic oddballs and quiet resistors, brought him in anyway, which turned out to be a mistake. In early 1944, after catching wind that the Gestapo was about to arrest him, Vermeeren did something spectacularly undramatic. He left. Just left. Disguised himself, took his wife Elizabeth, and defected to Britain via Turkey. The moment they vanished, the Nazi security apparatus panicked. Hitler, in classic overreaction, dismantled large parts of the Abwehr in retaliation. The British, meanwhile, weren't sure what to make of them. The Vermeerens weren't your typical defectors. They weren't driven by ideology or espionage glamour. They were driven by the simple human horror of watching their country cannibalize itself. Erich and Elizabeth gave the Allies information, yes. But more than that, they gave the Reich a psychological black eye. One couple, one defection, and entire departments collapsed in paranoia. And yet their escape had roots in something even older than politics. Something whispered, hidden, religious, a sense of divine duty. Which brings us to a quieter figure, the man whose betrayal began not with a suitcase, but with a letter. A very, very specific letter. 4. Elizabeth von Plettenberg, Vermeeren. Elizabeth von Plettenberg wasn't supposed to matter. In the Reich's bureaucratic hierarchy of cruelty, she barely registered. But that's the thing about overlooked women married to soft-spoken men. Sometimes they're the axis around which history quietly spins. Baroness Elizabeth came from old nobility. Catholic, sharp, unimpressed by goose-stepping ideologues who replaced scripture with slogans. Her marriage to Erich Vermeeren was a partnership in the truest sense, ideological, moral, tactical. So when the Gestapo circled and Erich needed a way out, it was Elizabeth who helped engineer the escape. She didn't just follow her husband into defection. She was the co-pilot. In Turkey they reached the British, and suddenly this aristocratic couple became weapons of perception. Nazis abandoning ship wasn't new, but cultured Nazis, ones with titles, with families, who looked like the future of the Reich, leaving? That sent shockwaves through the regime. Hitler's rage was instant and theatrical. The fallout was immense. The Abwehr, already under suspicion, collapsed soon after. And yet, even after the war, Elizabeth received little recognition. Her work was quiet. But in a regime obsessed with loyalty, her defiance was the deadliest thing of all, dignified. Which brings us to another figure with dignity and danger in equal measure. A scientist. A man who leaked the Reich's technological secrets in a brown envelope and nearly vanished because of it. 5. Hans Ferdinand Meyer. In 1939, long before the world had learned to flinch at the word blitzkrieg, a plain envelope appeared at the British Embassy in Oslo. No return address, no theatrics, just pages of neatly typed German military secrets. It would become known as the Oslo Report, one of the most valuable intelligence documents Britain received before the war fully exploded. And the man who sent it? Hans Ferdinand Meyer, a research director at Siemens and a reluctant cog in the Nazi war machine. Meyer wasn't a spy. He was a physicist. But he had something more dangerous than a gun. Access. Radar systems, airplane specs, weapons tests. He saw everything. And unlike many of his colleagues, he didn't think just following orders would look noble at the gallows. So during a business trip to Norway, he hand-delivered the report, using clever misdirection and disposable typewriters. British intelligence didn't know who he was for years. He kept his name off it. That's how badly he didn't want the glory. Or the gallows. The Oslo report went straight to Churchill's desk. Meyer returned to Germany, silent and unsuspected. But in the increasingly paranoid Third Reich, silence was suspicious. Which makes it all the more incredible that another insider, one embedded even deeper in the scientific elite, managed to stay invisible for the rest of the war, while feeding the Allies everything. 6. Paul Rosbaud, Paul Rosbaud smiled too much for a man surrounded by death factories. As the science editor for Springer Verlag, Germany's largest scientific publishing house, Rosbaud had unrestricted access to the Reich scientific community, its labs, its researchers, its war crimes in progress. And what did he do with that access? He told the British everything. Under the code name Griffin, Rosbaud became MI6's quiet man on the inside. His reports helped the Allies understand Nazi atomic research, secret weapons projects, and the technical infrastructure powering Hitler's war. While top physicists flirted with building the bomb, Rosbaud sabotaged their timelines one cable at a time. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't paid. He did it because he knew where all this was going, and he couldn't stomach it. Even as his own Jewish wife and daughter fled the country, Rosbaud stayed behind, maintained appearances, printed scientific journals by day, smuggled classified information by night. His life was a contradiction wrapped in a lab coat. And somehow he survived. After the war, he didn't cash in. No victory lap, just silence. But resistance, it turns out, didn't always come from spies or soldiers. Sometimes it came from lawyers in pinstripe suits carrying letters to the Vatican, letters meant for London. 7. Joseph Müller. Joseph Müller looked like a man who belonged in a courtroom, not a conspiracy. Well-groomed, polite, Catholic to the bone. The kind of lawyer you'd trust with a will, not the future of Europe, which is exactly why he worked. Nicknamed Ox. Müller had no military swagger, no spy glamour. What he had was access, discretion, and a moral code that didn't bend easily. Through his legal work and Abwehr-linked contacts, Müller became a courier between the German resistance and the outside world. Not just any outside world, the Vatican. In the early years of the war, Müller carried messages from anti-Hitler officers to British intelligence via Rome. These weren't love letters. They were desperate proposals. Remove Hitler, negotiate peace, stop the bleeding before Germany dragged itself into total ruin. The British listened. They doubted. They stalled. History, as usual, did what it does best. Müller was eventually arrested by the Gestapo, interrogated, shuffled through prisons and camps. But somehow, through a combination of luck, faith, and bureaucratic chaos, he survived. After the war, he didn't fade away. He became a prominent political figure in West Germany, helping shape a democracy built atop the wreckage he once tried to prevent. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many chances did history quietly ignore? Because while Müller was carrying letters through Rome, another man inside German intelligence was doing something far riskier, warning the enemy about invasions before they happened. 8. Hans Oster. Hans Oster was the kind of man the Nazis should have feared most, and never did. A senior Abwehr officer, a Prussian general, decorated, respected, and utterly convinced that Hitler was a disaster masquerading as destiny. Oster didn't leak secrets out of guilt alone. He leaked them out of contempt. In 1939 and 1940, Oster repeatedly warned foreign governments, most famously the Dutch, about impending German invasions. Dates, routes, timelines, everything an enemy would need to prepare. The warnings were so precise they should have been believed. They weren't. That's the cruelty of Oster's story. He betrayed the Reich with accuracy, and was ignored anyway. Inside Germany, Oster worked quietly to undermine Hitler's authority, assisting resistance circles and supporting coup attempts that never quite ignited. He believed Germany could be saved from itself, if only enough officers remembered their oaths were to the nation, not the man screaming from the podium. Eventually the net tightened. Oster was arrested after the July 20th plot, even though his resistance predated it by years. This time, there was no escape through paperwork or silence. But Oster's quiet defiance planted a seed. Loyalty could be selective. Obedience was optional. And one man watching all of this, learning how survival worked in the new Germany, would make his own escape, not with a warning, but with a disappearance. 9. Otto John. Otto John survived by mastering the art of ambiguity. Officially, he was a lawyer. Unofficially, he was connected to the July 20th plotters. And after the failed attempt to remove Hitler, ambiguity became the difference between life and erasure. John didn't stand trial. He didn't make a speech. He vanished. Using contacts cultivated through intelligence back channels, John escaped to Britain. There, he didn't become a hero. He became a tool. British intelligence put him to work in psychological operations, propaganda aimed at convincing Germans that resistance was still possible, that not everyone had surrendered their conscience. After the war, John returned to Germany and rose to a position few would expect, head of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. The irony was thick enough to choke on. A former resistance-linked defector now guarding the new German state from extremism. And then, years later, he disappeared again. This time into East Germany, under circumstances still argued about today. Defection? Abduction? A final act of confusion in a life built on blurred lines? Otto John never fit clean categories. Not hero, not villain. Just proof that survival in the shadow of the Reich required constant reinvention. And while these men operated in secrecy and silence, others, far more notorious, far more compromised, would eventually negotiate with the Allies openly, wearing SS uniforms while doing it. 10. Karl Wolff. Karl Wolff knew which way the wind was blowing, and he made sure to wear the right uniform while pretending it didn't smell like smoke. SS Obergruppenführer, senior Nazi officer, close Himmler confidant. His resume read like a war crimes indictment waiting to happen. But by 1945, Wolff wasn't interested in the Third Reich's funeral. He was already auditioning for the sequel. As Germany crumbled, Wolff became the key liaison in secret negotiations with the American OSS in Switzerland. The operation, codenamed Sunrise, was surreal. High-ranking Nazi officers sitting across from Allied spies, not as prisoners, but as partners. The deal? A quiet surrender of German forces in northern Italy to avoid further Soviet encroachment and preserve whatever sliver of dignity was left. Wolff played both sides. He reassured Berlin that nothing was happening, then flew to Lucerne to sip coffee with Alan Dulles. It worked. German troops in Italy surrendered weeks before the official end of the war. Wolff walked away not only alive, but largely untouched by post-war justice. His secret? Timing. He didn't stop being a Nazi. He just stopped being loyal when loyalty became a liability. And yet he wasn't alone in the room. Another man, equally decorated, equally calculating, sat at that same surrender table, signing away the Reich's last strategic illusion. 11. Heinrich von Wittinghoff. Heinrich von Wittinghoff looked more like a classical scholar than a Wehrmacht commander. But beneath the academic facade was a man who had overseen some of the most brutal campaigns in Europe. And by 1945, he had also come to a cold, pragmatic conclusion. Hitler had lost, and continuing to fight was suicide by ideology. As supreme commander of German forces in Italy, Wittinghoff was the highest-ranking officer involved in the Operation Sunrise arrangements. He wasn't a moral rebel. He wasn't a closet dissident. He was a tactician. And tactically, prolonging the war in Italy meant needless death and Soviet advances. Neither appealed. So while still officially under orders from Berlin, Wittinghoff quietly sanctioned negotiations with the OSS. His involvement was careful, veiled in military protocol, but his signature would appear on documents that effectively ended the war in Italy before Berlin could collapse. After the war, he wasn't hanged. He wasn't even tried. He slipped into obscurity, then post-war rehabilitation. His defense was simple. He had helped the Allies end the fighting early, which was technically true, But those surrender documents had more than one signature, and sitting beside him, calmly surrendering on behalf of the SS, was a man whose rank made the whole arrangement even more surreal. 12. Eugen Wenner. Eugen Wenner was not a household name in Nazi Germany, not a mastermind, not a Himmler, just an SS Sturmbannführer, major rank, bureaucratic enough to go unnoticed, important enough to sign the Reich's last real act of military diplomacy. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on every front, Wenner acted as one of the official emissaries to the OSS during the secret surrender negotiations in northern Italy. His role wasn't ceremonial. He helped coordinate the paperwork, the travel, the pretense that Germany could still control how it lost. The irony? Wenner's presence meant the SS, Hitler's most fanatical institution, was now brokering peace with the Allies behind the Führer's back. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't courage. It was realism with a uniform. He signed the surrender agreement at Caserta alongside Wehrmacht officers. The war in Italy ended days later. For a man tasked with defending the Reich to the death, Wenner instead chose a desk, a pen, and a quiet exit strategy. And next to him, also signing with the calm detachment of a man surrendering someone else's cause, stood another officer, one whose name, like Wenner's, never made the history books, but whose signature helped dismantle a dying empire. 13. Victor von Schweinitz. Victor von Schweinitz was the kind of officer who never made headlines, until the day he helped end a war. As a lieutenant colonel on the German general staff, Schweinitz's name didn't carry weight like his superiors, but it ended up on one of the most symbolically important documents of the European theater, the surrender at Caserta. On April 29, 1945, Schweinitz was dispatched alongside Eugen Wenner to negotiate the terms of the unconditional surrender of all German forces in Italy. The SS and Wehrmacht had spent years coordinating repression there. Now they were quietly coordinating retreat. Schweinitz wasn't a philosopher of resistance, nor was he deluded by dreams of a Fourth Reich. He was, like many men in uniforms with empty armbands, just trying to survive the collapse with a signature instead of a bullet. The Caserta surrender took effect days before Hitler's suicide. But by then, men like Schweinitz had already begun the great pivot, swapping ideology for plausible deniability. And while some quietly vanished into post-war anonymity, others remained in the shadows of diplomacy, especially those like the man watching all of this unfold from his post in Mussolini's crumbling puppet state. 14. Rudolf Rahn. Rudolf Rahn was fluent in diplomacy, which is a polite way of saying he was fluent in betrayal with a good tailor. As the German ambassador to the Italian Social Republic, the Nazi-backed shell state propping up Mussolini, Rahn was tasked with spinning disaster into policy. But by 1945, there was nothing left to spin. Rahn wasn't just another paper pusher. According to declassified CIA materials and OSS records, Rahn was one of the key players involved in the subtle, deniable pre-negotiations that led to Operation Sunrise. While publicly defending the Reich's interests in northern Italy, he was privately signaling that Germany was ready to talk surrender, or at least that he was. His role is murky on purpose. That's how Rahn liked it. He sent cables that were just vague enough to be useful, maintained contact with middlemen, and made sure that if Berlin found out, he could plausibly say it was all just routine diplomacy. After the war, Rahn was briefly detained, questioned, and eventually released. He'd helped surrender part of the Reich and walked away with a pension. But while the Italian front quietly folded, another war of perception was brewing, this time in Soviet hands. And the next man didn't defect over coffee in Switzerland. He defected in a prison camp built on frost and fear. 15. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach had a name that sounded like a cavalry charge and a biography to match. A Prussian aristocrat turned general, He led the Allied Army Corps at Stalingrad. And when the Red Army finally crushed the German Sixth Army, Seydlitz became a guest of the Soviet Union. Unwillingly at first. But captivity has a way of rearranging loyalties. By 1943, Seydlitz had made a choice no other German general at his level had made so publicly. He joined the Soviet-sponsored National Committee for a Free Germany, a political propaganda front made up of POWs who urged fellow soldiers to abandon Hitler. He called on Wehrmacht officers to surrender, to disobey, to defect. In radio broadcasts, he spoke with the authority of a general and the desperation of a man trying to escape history's judgment. Back in Germany, he was declared a traitor. His family was ostracized, his name blacklisted. But Seydlitz had done what few others dared. He broke the officer's oath in favor of a higher reckoning. And beside him, another even higher-ranking prisoner would soon do the same, one whose face had once stared down the Soviet front lines from the highest balcony in the Reich. 16. Friedrich Paulus. Friedrich Paulus once dined with the architects of apocalypse, Field Marshal of the Sixth Army, planner of Operation Barbarossa, a man whose signature strategy was to push east until maps started to bleed. But Stalingrad changed everything. When the Red Army encircled his forces in the winter of 1942, Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the death. Instead, he surrendered. The highest-ranking German officer ever captured by the Soviets didn't go out with a bang. He went out with a handshake. And then, after a long silence, he started talking. In 1944, Paulus joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, the Soviet propaganda front made of captured Wehrmacht officers. His broadcasts urged German soldiers to surrender, to turn on Hitler, to choose survival over loyalty. Coming from a man once revered in military circles, his defection was a psychological earthquake. Berlin branded him a traitor. His wife died before he ever saw her again. But Paulus never recanted. After the war, he testified at Nuremberg, against his former comrades. And in the same prison camps where he made his choice, another man, a fighter pilot with a noble name, was preparing to deliver a different kind of betrayal, one rooted in youthful conviction. 17. Heinrich Graf von Einsiedel. Heinrich Graf von Einsiedel was born into nobility and raised for empire. A Luftwaffe ace by age 20, he seemed destined for medals, not manifestos. But war has a habit of unraveling even the most aristocratic trajectories. Captured by the Soviets in 1942, Einsiedel found himself a prisoner in a world that didn't care about titles. He could have waited the war out like so many others. Instead, he co-founded the National Committee for a Free Germany, becoming one of its youngest and most active voices. Fluent in multiple languages, he wrote leaflets, gave speeches, and pushed for a vision of Germany that didn't end in rubble. Unlike some of his fellow prisoners, Einsiedel wasn't an opportunist. He genuinely believed Nazism had to die for Germany to live. His betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was philosophical. After the war, he wasn't welcomed home. But he didn't vanish. He eventually entered politics in East Germany, then West. A man who had fought for Hitler at 19 would one day serve in the European Parliament. And seated next to him in those Soviet POW meetings was a man just as committed, just as persuasive, and just as politically radioactive. 18. Willy Riedel. Willy Riedel's war began like so many others, with obedience. A career officer in the Wehrmacht, he followed orders, climbed ranks, and did what was expected. Until the Eastern Front ate through all of that and left only choices, none of them clean. Captured by the Soviets, Riedel joined the NKFD not out of sudden ideology, but out of what historians might politely call complicated pragmatism. But Riedel didn't stop at signing his name. He leaned in, delivered speeches, wrote appeals, made himself into a usable face for the Soviet propaganda machine. One more proof point that German officers were waking up. He wasn't a theorist like some. He wasn't polished like Einstein or calculating like Beckler. Hitl had the tone of a man who'd seen enough mud, chaos, and betrayal to start calling things what they were. And that tone, plain-spoken, weary, unflinching, was oddly persuasive. Because sometimes it wasn't the big names that made soldiers question the war. It was the familiar ones. Men like Reich, who looked and sounded like the guy one bunk over, quietly saying, "It's not worth it anymore." And somewhere nearby in those same camps, another man, high-born, high-strung, and high on the Soviets' list of usable names, was preparing to deliver the same message with an entirely different kind of pedigree. 19. Otto Corfes. Otto Corfes had the posture of an old-school Prussian general, straight-backed, stern, and wrapped in the kind of dignity that doesn't flinch when regimes change. Before Stalingrad, he was a textbook officer, methodical, loyal, and utterly embedded in the Wehrmacht command structure. But after the surrender of the Sixth Army, his textbook got rewritten. Captured by the Soviets, Corfes became another unlikely voice in the National Committee for a Free Germany. He participated in radio broadcasts urging German officers to abandon their posts, join the cause of anti-fascism, and help bring down the regime they once served. It wasn't just a political move. For Corfes, it was a reckoning. He wasn't a firebrand or an ideologue. He was practical. The war was lost, the crimes undeniable. Joining the Soviets meant choosing a different kind of survival, one of conscience, not convenience. After the war, Corfes returned to East Germany, where he was given a new role, rewriting military education in a state that now wore red stars instead of eagles. He traded his epaulets for ideology. And next to him, in both spirit and circumstance, was another man whose post-war silence hid a Soviet-aligned past stitched with contradiction. 20. Martin Lattmann. Martin Lattmann didn't make many headlines, which is impressive, considering he was a German general who defected mid-war to join the Soviets. That's like leaving your chess game mid-checkmate to help your opponent move their pieces. Little is known about Lattmann's exact motivations. He wasn't captured at Stalingrad. He wasn't a vocal ideologue. But declassified CIA documents and post-war analysis place him firmly within the structure of the National Committee for a Free Germany, one of the generals who switched allegiance behind Soviet barbed wire and lent his name to broadcasts urging German collapse. Lattmann's significance isn't in dramatic speeches or flashy betrayal. It's in how ordinary his defection became. By 1944, enough German officers had made the leap that it no longer shocked intelligence agencies. It just complicated the question of what loyalty meant when survival was at stake. He wasn't punished after the war. In East Germany, former defectors like Lattmann were rehabilitated as quiet architects of the new Germany, the one that rejected the West and replaced its salute with ideology. And in those same converted camps turned lecture halls was another man, once a colonel, who would go on to help formalize the defection into an actual movement with its own bureaucracy. 21. Hans Günther van Hoeven. Hans Günther van Hoeven didn't look like a revolutionary. He was a colonel in the Wehrmacht. By the book, respectable, invisible to anyone not reading the footnotes of history. But in Soviet captivity, he became a founding member and vice president of the Bund Deutscher Offiziere, BDO, the League of German Officers, the formal military wing of the Soviet-aligned anti-Nazi front. The BDO wasn't just symbolic. It was organized, structured, and aimed at peeling away the Wehrmacht's officer corps from Hitler's grip. Van Hoeven was instrumental in creating that structure, building meeting systems, ideological schools, and broadcasts that specifically targeted career officers still on the front lines. He didn't rant. He persuaded. His speeches weren't fiery. They were surgical. Calm dissections of how Hitler's war had become a national suicide pact. After the war, Van Hooven faded into bureaucratic roles within East Germany, avoiding the spotlight he once used to try to dismantle the war machine from within. He never sought fame, only function. And in his circle, among the quiet builders of betrayal, was a man even harder to pin down, a loyal Nazi by party card, but not by conviction, who found himself rewriting his allegiances one Soviet tea break at a time. 22. Heinrich Hohmann. Heinrich Hohmann wore two uniforms, one sewn, one psychological. A Wehrmacht major and NSDAP member before his capture, Hohmann entered Soviet hands with credentials that screamed loyalty to the Reich. But those credentials would soon be repurposed into something far more subversive. While imprisoned by the Soviets, Hohmann joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, the propaganda and defection organization aimed at encouraging other captured German soldiers to abandon Hitler's war. For a man once affiliated with the Nazi Party, it was a strange pivot. But Hohmann leaned into it, not with theatrical denunciations or ideological rebirths, but with the slow, pragmatic adoption of a new reality. In Soviet captivity, men like Hohmann learned quickly. You either became a useful defector or an irrelevant prisoner. Hohmann chose the former. He participated in broadcasts, leaflets, and ideological discussions tailored to fracture German morale. After the war, like many NKFD members, Hohmann re-emerged in East Germany's institutional framework, his past scrubbed clean enough to blend in. But his path wasn't unique. In the bunk next to him sat another man who chose words over bullets and literature over loyalty, an officer who would write the war's aftermath from the inside out. 23. Heinrich Gerlach. Heinrich Gerlach knew the front lines from both sides, first as a Wehrmacht officer, then as a Soviet prisoner with a typewriter. Captured at Stalingrad, Gerlach spent years in Soviet POW camps where he became a co-founder of the Bund Deutscher Offiziere and a contributor to the Free Germany newspaper, the NKFD's main propaganda publication. But Gerlach didn't just speak against Hitler. He wrote it down. His fiction blurred the lines between personal trauma, political disillusionment, and psychological collapse. His most famous work, The Forsaken Army, was based on his Stalingrad diaries, originally seized by Soviet authorities and rewritten from memory years later. The book didn't glorify betrayal. It exposed the moral erosion that came from serving a dying empire. His defection wasn't loud or ideological. It was literary. His weapon was narrative. Gerlach wasn't pardoned by history, but he wasn't erased either. He represented a third category, those who resisted by chronicling, who turned the act of remembering into a kind of rebellion. And he wasn't alone. Among the NKFD's quieter participants was another man, less known, less public, but who carried the long name and short leash of a noble forced to choose sides in the dark. 24. Egbert von Frankenberg und Proschlitz. Egbert von Frankenberg and Proschlitz had a name that sounded like a castle, and in a different timeline he probably would have died defending one. But history had other plans. Captured by Soviet forces and folded into the growing ranks of the National Committee for a Free Germany, Proschlitz's role was subtle, bureaucratic, and mostly absent from post-war headlines. He wasn't a speechmaker or a defiant ideologue. He was the kind of man who showed up to meetings, edited documents, and nodded at the right moments, which, in Soviet eyes, made him extremely valuable. His noble background gave the NKFD and BDO a strange kind of legitimacy. If even his kind were turning on Hitler, then surely something had shifted in the soul of the Reich. Proschlitz embodied that shift, from aristocratic military tradition to a cooperative posture under Soviet oversight. He didn't publish memoirs. He didn't make post-war declarations. But his presence in the structure of Germany's internal surrender says everything about how the regime's pillars were quietly dismantled, from the inside. And standing nearby, observing, and eventually joining in, was a man with perhaps the most bizarre arc of all, a Nazi general who defected, cooperated, and then quietly served the East German state. 25. Rudolf Baumler. Rudolf Baumler was a study in contradictions, wrapped in a uniform that fit a little too well. A general in the Wehrmacht, a former SD officer, an early NSDAP member. On paper, he was the kind of man you'd expect to go down with the ship. Instead, he quietly climbed aboard the lifeboat and helped row it in the opposite direction. Captured by the Soviets after years of service under the Nazi command, Baumler didn't spend long sulking in his cell. He defected, not just privately, but structurally. Joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, Baumler aligned himself with the Soviet vision of post-Nazi redemption, or at least reinvention. He helped legitimize the organization from the top down. When a man like Baumler switches sides, the propaganda value writes itself. But Baumler wasn't just a symbolic turncoat. After the war, he helped shape the East German military, not as a hidden advisor, but openly, as part of the machinery of a state that now claimed to be anti-fascist, even while reusing the bones of the old system. The man who once served the Reich died a major general in the German Democratic Republic. Which leaves one final question. How many more like him were never caught, never listed, never named, but still walked out of one regime and into the next without even changing coats?